Well, thanks very much, Josh, and good evening, my dearly loved young people. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you tonight. My thoughts go out to Nathan, who no doubt prepared very diligently for this week with you, but is unable to be with us tonight, being in New Zealand. So, over the course of this week, we're going to look at Moses, the servant of God, a truly remarkable character in Scripture. A man, a brother who stands as one of the greats of the Bible. And I trust that together we'll get to know him very well over this week together. We're introduced to Moses and his parents here in Exodus chapter 2. But it's in verse 7 of the preceding chapter that we get the context. Because we read there that the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. To the point that in verse 9, Pharaoh said unto his people, "Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we." So Pharaoh had this deep fear of an uprising of this people. And that fear became so intense that he instituted something quite extraordinary. In verse 22 we read, "Every son that is born of them you shall cast into the river." So it's into this extraordinary background of nationally sanctioned genocide that Moses is born. What a remarkable set of circumstances to be born into. And it's against that background that we stand in awe, really, of the courage and the faith, the bravery of Moses' parents. Look at verse 3, or verse 2 to start with. We read there that Jochebed, when she saw Moses was a goodly child, hid him 3 months, until in verse 3 she could no longer hide him. I'm sure, no doubt, the sound of his crying made it unsafe for Amram and Jochebed to continue to hide their child. Now, we might just sort of read that and somewhat skim over it and think, yeah, that's courageous, it's brave. But we perhaps don't fully appreciate just how extraordinary their faith was until we read Stephen's words in Acts chapter 7. So he tells us in Acts 7 verse 19 that really Jochebed stood alone amongst all the people, all of her fellow people, because it says there in Acts 7 verse 19 that Pharaoh dealt subtly with our kindred and evil entreated our fathers so that they cast out their young children. Others were doing it. For fear of death, they were casting out their children, sacrificing their children that they might live. And it's against that background that we see the remarkable faith of Jochebed. So young people, just ask yourself the question. So many of us in this life are so intent on conforming, assimilating, integrating, not standing out in any way, not being conspicuous amongst what we might refer to as the world. How would we go standing out amongst our fellow young people when our fellow young people, due to pressure from the government, for fear of their life, seek to give in, to cave in to that pressure not to be different? Would we still have the courage then when everybody around us is giving in? It's a really, really remarkable act of faith. And we read that in Hebrews 11 verse 23. You don't need to turn this one up. If you do want to, that's fine. But it says there, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. So there the writer to the Hebrews makes it very, very clear that this was a remarkable act of faith and courage in the face of certain death. Now, why was that? Well, it says in the record that Moses was, in Exodus 2 verse 2, a goodly child. And in Hebrews 11 verse 23 it says that he was a proper child. Now, these two words in the Hebrew and the Greek essentially mean the very same thing. They mean beautiful or good-looking. Moses clearly was a very, very beautiful child. But it's much more than that, really, isn't it? Because Stephen, in Acts 7, verse 20, tells us that Moses was exceeding fair. Now, the word fair is virtually the same word as proper or goodly. It means essentially beautiful or very attractive. But the word exceeding in the Greek is the Greek word theos, which means God. So the point Stephen is making in Acts 7 is really that it was clear to Amram and Jochebed that Moses was a God-blessed child. It was very clear that he was a special child, no ordinary child, a child that had been sent from God, a child who we will later see as a man that the Spirit of God dwelt in him. And that was very clear to Amram and Jochebed. And it was for this reason that, undaunted by all these mercenaries and Egyptian vigilantes that were going around, roaming around, taking all the children, the sons of the Hebrews, and casting them to the river, it was for this reason that Amram and Jochebed stood firm in their courage. We read then that Jochebed is ultimately able to nurse her child. She was very courageous. She places her little child in this ark of bulrushes and gently places him by the reeds of the river. And we know the story that Pharaoh's daughter comes and finds Moses. So have a look in verse 10. We read there that the child grew, and Jochebed brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So this is really important. During this period between the first 3 months when Moses was with his parents, and then this next subsequent period that Amram and Jochebed had Moses and were able to nurse the child. Jochebed was able to nurse him. It's quite a long period of time because up until this point, Moses is referred to as a child. When Jochebed brings Moses to or back to Pharaoh's daughter, he's referred to as her son. This is quite an interesting point because in Hebrew tradition, the weaning period of a child was deemed to be about 5 years. That's still the case in parts of the world today. It's certainly not in our modern developed society here in Australia, but in other parts of the world, that can be all the way up to 7. But in Hebrew tradition, it's around about 5 years. And so during this time, I have no doubt that Amram and Jochebed spent an extraordinary time instilling in little Moses everything that would become very dear to him, a very deep appreciation of who he was, a Hebrew, his identity, his faith, his concept of a God. Yes, perhaps Jochebed was able to also visit Moses and continue that education in the royal court. But I believe these 5 years were very important. You see, in the life of a child, and this is very relevant for all of our new parents or would-be parents, it's very commonly known that the first 5 years of a child's life are the most important in their development. In preparing for this, I read up quite a lot on this, and one researcher's comment really stood out for me. The researcher said, in those first 5 years, a child becomes the person they are going to be. And I have no doubt that Amram and Jochebed really took advantage of that. But look again in verse 10 of Exodus 2. We read there that Moses became her son, the son of Pharaoh's daughter, an Egyptian princess. It's hard for us to really enter into that. A princess of the empire of the world. Now, Stephen tells us in Acts 7, verse 21, that she, this princess, nourished him for her own son, which is exactly the same word that's in Acts 7, verse 20, where it says that Moses was nourished up in his father's house. So here, young people, we have a battle. We have Moses being nourished up in his parents' home in all the attributes and characteristics of God, the ways of God. And then, from perhaps the age of 5 or 6 onwards, nourished in the mythology of the Egyptian empire. A real battle for the mind of this young boy growing up in a house of Levi. And again, young people, we need to make these lessons real to us. Many of us have grown up in the truth. Many of us have been born into a family who believes in God. We've had that education. But many of us here looking out at you tonight are now being confronted with the philosophies and ideologies of this world. Will we, like Moses, remain true to our first love? Will we stand as a Hebrew? There are many in this world who would like to nourish us as a son of this world, as a son of the Egyptians. Will we be true to what we have learned in our youth? You see, for Moses, it never left him for the next 35 years in the royal Egyptian court. And again, for parents, it's really important. How much do we really invest in those early years, those formative, impressionable, critical years in the lives of our children? Or are we too busy and we miss that golden opportunity? I get a sense that Moses reflected back on this when he wrote some of his, almost like his memoirs in Deuteronomy. I'm going to read to you Deuteronomy 6, verse 6. Is this perhaps the experience Moses had in those first 5 years at home? Knowing that he was a special child. Remember that. He was a very special child. So his education was even more relevant. Deuteronomy 6, verse 6. You shall teach these words diligently unto your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. You shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, and they shall be as frontlets before your eyes. And you shall write them upon the posts of your house, on your gates, lest you forget the Lord. It's my belief that that's exactly what Amram and Jochebed did. And many of us, brothers and sisters, in many of our homes have little posters and quotes in the home and those sorts of things. You can imagine that Amram and Jochebed doubled down. We've got this short time. Let's use every opportunity. Again, the question is whether we live like that, or are we casual, nonchalant, blasé, ambivalent to that opportunity to learn? Well, when we consider the education of Moses, it's important we enter into just how immersive it was in Egypt. we'll learn that he was schooled as a young prince in all the ways of Egypt. Have a look at, maybe again I'll just read it to you in Acts 7 verse 22. It says there, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and in deeds. Now this word learned in the Greek is a word that's come straight across to the English. It's pedagogy, which really means to teach. It's a university lecturer, for example, would be engaged in pedagogy, teaching, instructing. But it's more than that, because in the Greek it has the idea of to chastise, to straighten, and it speaks really of a very holistic training of this prince of the Egyptian court. Yes, schooled and taught all the ways of Egypt, schooled at the feet of the master is in actual fact really what the Greek means, to be tutored at the feet of a master. But it's more than that. It speaks of an athlete, a physical specimen of a young man, trained to be an elite athlete, a powerful soldier, a weapon intellectually and physically. What about the next word that we see in Acts 7 verse 22 where it says words? The word words in the Greek is a word we'd know well. It's the word logos, logic, theology, logician. A logician was Moses. He was again tutored in all the laws and philosophies of Egypt. An elite athlete, a good-looking young man who was able to move freely amongst the intellectual elite of Egypt. And then the word deeds in the Greek is actually the word ergon, from which we get the word ergonomics, which really means to work. Moses, young people, was not just a very handsome, very well-educated, very smart, elite athlete, a trained soldier, skilled in all the law and philosophies and arguments. He was also an astute businessman, a man of means and wealth who excelled in the Egyptian court. You know, young people, today, in this age, one of the most overused words is unprecedented. But I'm going to use it because I think in this context it's true. Never before has there been a generation where at an incredibly young age, you can experience fame, notoriety, prestige, position, status, and wealth. Never before has there been more millionaires, and that recognises the time value of money and all of that, under 30. Never before has there been more billionaires, again considering the relativity of the value of money, ever before in history, under 30. If you want it, young people, you will get it. You can be anything you want to be. In fact, you will be what you want to be. If you seek for fame, fortune, title, money, you will get it. In fact, the Bible is very clear that we will have our reward. Jesus said, "Woe to you who are rich, for you have received your reward." You will receive it. It's just that it won't be God cheering about that. We'll have our reward, the treasure that disappears. A very sort of transient and temporary wealth that has no enduring value. But that which lasts for eternity will be lost if we don't keep the balance. Moses was wealthy. Joseph was wealthy. Abraham, they experienced extraordinary success, but they never forgot who they were. Pray that will be true of us young people. The opportunity for you is extraordinary in the kingdom. Let's have our eyes focused on the real prize. Now we read in Acts 7 verse 23 that when Moses was full 40 years old, 40 years, perhaps 35, in this Egyptian court, a prince of the empire of the world. But at 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren. And it's here that we get our first glimpse into something I trust you'll see over the course of our studies, and that is the beautiful heart of Moses. In the New Testament, it's unique of the Lord Jesus Christ that he was moved with compassion. He had a heart that bled for others, and Moses was just the same. It came into his heart to visit his brethren. That word came, again in the Greek, means to ascend. It welled up inside him. Yes, he had been adopted into this extraordinary Egyptian life, but he could never resist the urge to be with his brethren and sisters. And we read in Exodus 2 verse 11 that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens. And looked on their burdens. Now note that. He went out. Young people, Moses wasn't just a man of good intentions. He was a doer and not just a sayer. The feeling, the urge, the instinct welled up inside him, and he went out. He did it. He didn't leave that good intention undone. He went. And it says that he looked and beheld the burdens of his brethren. Now that perhaps gives us a sense that in his elite, privileged existence, he was perhaps isolated, shielded, quarantined, we might say, from his brethren, from the Hebrews. Now we'll learn later, much later about this, that Hebrews were farmers, and a farmer to an Egyptian was despised. They were referred to as an abomination. And so no doubt the prince would have had nothing to do with them, shielded entirely from this race that all the Egyptians looked down upon. But again, note that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens. You know, I think it's kind of funny, really, that one of the things that defines our generation, it's probably a little bit presumptuous to include me in that, but your generation, is the selfie, isn't it? A selfie, you know, take a selfie. Sort of insightful, really, isn't it? Because we are probably living in the most selfish generation ever. And we can become very self-absorbed, self-pity, all of our issues, all of our woes. I'm going to sort of twist this because I'm sort of not able to see most of you. That's better. I hope that's still, you can hear me. And we can become very, very self-absorbed in ourselves, our issues, our burdens, our woes. And yes, we can get down. And yes, depression and all of those things are very, very real and very, very serious. But often it doesn't get to that in terms of an actual medical issue for us. But we can become absorbed with self, our issues, our woes. The best way that many of us have found to deal with those issues is to look out to stop looking at ourselves and to look at others and discover that actually the burden that so many others are bearing is far heavier than ours. And all of a sudden we get that perspective that comes from recognising the challenges and the issues of others. And then, if we go one step even beyond that, we can experience that great sense of lightening of our load and replacing it with the joy that comes from helping relieve the burden of another. That was Moses. He went out physically and beheld the burdens of his brethren, and his heart went out to them too. He acted on that instinct. He didn't leave it undone. There's a great little saying: the smallest deed done is greater than the greatest intention left undone. Let's not be a could have been, would have been, might have, wish I did. Let's do it. Just do it. If you feel that urge to give, to contribute, to serve, to look out for another, act on it. Do it. Because that only then do we translate the intent into the actual action. Look also at the empathy and the love of Moses for his people. Look at verse 11. It says there, he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. Wow. It was in Egypt as a prince of the royal court for at least 35 years. Always a Hebrew. Always his brethren. There's a beautiful verse, young people, in 1 Corinthians 12, verse 26. It says, when one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. And that was so true of Moses. We'll see this right through our studies. Whenever one of Moses' brethren suffered, he felt it. He really felt it. Physically, it moved him, and it moved him to do things. So young people, again, ask yourself, how deep is your sense of affinity and affection for your fellow young people? When one of your young people is suffering, what do you do? Do you actually do something? Or just think, oh, that's sad? Or it'd be nice to visit them. It'd be nice to send them a gift or a card and do nothing. If I can teach you just one little lesson, and sometimes my wife says that I'm a bit too impulsive with this sort of stuff, but when you feel that impulse or that urge, that sense of wanting to do something, just do it. Drop things and do it, because otherwise, have you felt this? 2 days later, you go, oh, I just didn't do it. Or weeks later, it sort of pricks your conscience and you go, I missed that. So actually do it, which is one of the great lessons of Moses. The Lord Jesus was just the same. He felt it when his brother felt it. There's that great lesson when Jesus appears to Saul on the road to Damascus. You know, he's already ascended to heaven, and he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I am the one who you are persecuting. Well, was he? Of course not, directly. But any persecution of Christ's brethren and sisters is felt by him. Do we again feel that when our fellow young people may experience oppression? And do we do something? Do we have the same care one for another? You know, one of the most confronting verses I find on this is written by James. He has a really powerful and confronting thing to say. that's really relevant in our ecclesial life today. James chapter 2, verse 15, he says, "If a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you say unto them, Depart in peace. Be you warmed and filled, notwithstanding you give them not those things which they need. What does it profit? Even so, faith, if it doesn't have works, is dead." Being alone. You know, young people, I'm telling you, you've done this, I've done this, we've all done this. Sunday morning, brother or sister, how you going? Oh, how you going? It's a funny thing, Aussies. Someone says, how you going? And we say, how you going, straight back. Well, you've just asked me, and now you've asked me. It's a very weird thing, but we just, how you going, how you going? Good, great, or excellent. God bless. That's the expression, depart in peace, God bless. But we do nothing, absolutely nothing, to actually help them. As I say, you've done that, haven't you? I've done that. We know their situation, but we do nothing. Be, young people, one of the people in the ecclesia who does stuff. And you don't know who they are yet, perhaps. Some of you will. They're the people when you need it that randomly appear at your front door with food. Or you get a card and there's money in it to help you through an extraordinary expense that's just been thrust upon you. Or in this state, there's people who have walked out the front door and all of a sudden there's a car there. It's a bit of a bomb, but on the mantle there is a set of keys because they had no car, because they couldn't afford it. Be one of those people, young people. Be a doer. You know, the Bible talks about those who love in tongue. Word and tongue. Just word and tongue. And Jesus says, no, love in deed and in truth. Be a doer, not a sayer. We talk a big game, brethren and sisters and young people. But do we walk the talk? Be a doer. Be like Moses. And by the way, you know, it's an interesting one here with Moses. We know that Jesus said, if someone smites you on the cheek, turn to him the other. Yeah? And we sometimes pose those funny hypotheticals. Oh, well, you know, what would you do if you came home and someone was assaulting your mum? Well, you would have to turn the other cheek. No, you wouldn't. You would get in there and save your mum as best you could. There's nothing in the scripture that says we wouldn't go to the aid of, for example, the little sheep that's stuck. Jesus actually said that's the right thing to do. Moses, unfortunately, just went a little too far, didn't he? He exacted the ultimate vengeance, and we know that the Bible says that vengeance is mine, I will repay. So that wasn't the right thing for Moses to do. But we shouldn't judge Moses too harshly for what he did here. All right, where will we go next? Well, let's look back at this because it's actually quite interesting. Verse 12, we see that he furtively looks this way and that way, and he saw that there was no man, and he slew him, as we've noted. He slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, Stephen tells us in Acts 7, verse 24, that seeing one of his brethren suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian. That word seeing means to know or experience. Again, it speaks to this feeling of Moses, that he felt it. He felt the pain of his brother. To suffer wrong means to suffer an injustice. And this is the thing that we'll see with Moses. Whenever he sees an injustice, whenever he sees one of his people being poorly treated, he has a natural instinct, an impulse, a propensity to do something, to get in and defend his people. And at times, that instinct is a challenge for him, and we'll see that throughout our week together. But what we want to see here in the positive is Moses as the great defender of his people. He defended him. Acts 7 verse 24. He defended his brother. As I said, on this occasion, he went just a little too far. So what about us young people when we see one of our own, a fellow young person? Perhaps they suffer wrong. Perhaps they cop a little bit of grief from others. Maybe that's in our own community. Maybe that's from without. What do we do? Do we do nothing? Or are we prepared to stand up for our fellow young person to defend them, like Moses? And we'll see that again, that he does that a little later in the record as well. Now, why did Moses do what he did? Was it just this compassionate side, this urge to act, or was there perhaps something more to this? Well, I think, again, Stephen gives us an insight that there probably was, well, there definitely was, in my view, more to this. You see, you might put in your margin that in Acts 7 verse 25, it says that Moses supposed his brethren would have understood how that God, by his hand, would deliver them. He supposed that his brethren would have understood that God, by his hand, would deliver them. That word understand means to put two and two together. Moses thought that his people would get it, that he was their promised Saviour, that he was the one to come to liberate them. He thought they'd worked that out. But unfortunately, Acts 7 verse 25, it says that they understood not. That word, by the way, deliver, is the word salvation. Moses did this because he thought and recognised, perhaps from his interaction with his God, that this was his chosen mission to liberate, to save his people. But it didn't go so well, did it? It didn't go so well at all on this occasion, where he ended up slaying the Egyptian. Undeterred, though, in verse 13 of Exodus 2, we read that when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews this time strove together, and he said to him that did the wrong, "Why are you smiting your brother? Why are you doing this to your brother?" To Moses, this was like bizarre. This was his people, who his heart went out to. He had discovered his people, and here he discovers 2 of them fighting, and one in particular, the protagonist, the antagonist in all of this, doing the wrong. He says, "Why would you do this to your fellow brother?" Again, Stephen's very helpful because he picks up on Moses, this great defender, right? Here's another person suffering an injustice. The day before it was one of his brethren with an Egyptian. Now it's one of his brethren with another brother. And he's the great defender. He steps in to intervene. Acts 7, it says that he would have set them at one again, saying, "Sirs, you are brethren. Why do you wrong one to another? Why do you do wrong to each other?" Now note that expression, he would have set them at one again. It's a beautiful expression when it comes to Moses. Moses, we know as a meek man, but a huge aspect of Moses' life was being an intercessor. We'll see that in one of our studies. An intercessor. He pleaded with God for his people. A mediator, the defender. He sought to make brethren at one again. He was a peacemaker. Now, young people, it is far more important that you know the atonement in practice than you ever do in theory. Theory in itself means nothing. Knowledge puffs up, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13. If you are a walking encyclopedia on the atonement but don't do it, it means nothing. Young people, be an expert in doing it. You may not be a genius in explaining the atonement. You may have a very simple view that we're sinners, we die as a consequence. Christ was sinless, he came to save us. And I want to do similar for my brethren and sisters and fellow young people. I want to lay down my life for them. I want to make people at one like Jesus wants to make us at one with God. I live it. Moses did stuff, young people. Be a doer, not a sayer. Walk the talk, don't just talk it. He sought to make his brethren at one. What does the protagonist say? As so often happens, you see two people fighting, someone tries to go intervene, they are the ones that end up in hospital inevitably. It's a bit sad that, isn't it? But it's often the way. Verse 14, who made you a prince, as it should read? Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Okay, you're a prince, an Egyptian prince, but who made you a judge over us? It's a bit sad, really. In our community still, we hear that all the time. Just ask any ecclesial elder in this hall. Have they ever heard that? Oh, who are you to judge? Who do you think you are? Just because you're an AB, we might call it, or a serving brother, or an elder in the ecclesia, who are you to judge? It's a pretty old-fashioned thing to say, really. They said it right back here. Oh, Moses, who are you to judge? Verse 14, do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Look at that. The word of this Egyptian prince who had walked on in the day before and killed an Egyptian had spread like wildfire through the Hebrew camp, right through every town, right through every village of the Hebrews, such that we read, Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Surely this thing is known. Young people, when we sin, and when people sin, they like to try to bury it. And sometimes other people like to try to bury the sin of other people. What did Moses do with the Egyptian that he killed? He buried him under the sand. But what does wind have a habit of doing to sand? Over time, we see the shifting sands blown by the wind, and it reveals a lot of skeletons. Young people, don't try and bury your sin under the sand. Try not to sin in the first place, but don't bury it. Confess your faults one to another. Confess, most importantly, to God that we might be forgiven. It's no good taking sin and just sweeping it under the carpet. We've done a bit of that in our community over the years, and it really hasn't been helpful, has it? Maybe we learn a new way. We don't do that anymore. We acknowledge it, we forgive, and we move on. It's a big lesson from Moses that it didn't stay hidden under the sand all that long. We think we can bury it sometimes, but inevitably we're proven wrong. Now Moses had very good reason to be afraid. Verse 15, when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. You see, a lot later in chapter 4, verse 19, we read that the Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go, return into Egypt, for all the men are dead which sought your life." All the men who sought your life are now dead. The takeaway from that is that the Egyptian prince became the most wanted man in the empire, a fugitive, because Pharaoh sought to slay him. Now, why did Pharaoh seek to slay Moses? What's it referring to when it says in verse 15, when Pharaoh heard this thing? Many would say, this thing is that Moses had killed an Egyptian. I hardly think so. In fact, I'm very confident it has nothing to do with that. That could easily be justified as the righteous actions of a royal prince. What was this thing that Pharaoh sought to slay Moses? In a word, it was treason. Treason. Moses had walked away from the palace. He had walked away from Pharaoh's daughter. Perhaps, and again, if you ever wanted to do a very interesting study of Egyptian history and this era, it's very likely, young people, that Moses walked away from his own coronation to be the next Pharaoh. He walked away. And for that act of disloyalty, in Acts 7 verse 29, we read that Moses became a stranger in the land of Midian. He who was once royalty now sat hunted, forlorn, a stranger and a foreigner by a humble well in Midian. And we read in verse 16, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away. Classic instance that would cut to the heart of Moses. Oppressive shepherds, 7 vulnerable women seeking to draw water from a well. What do we think happens? Moses can't help himself. Those same feelings of compassion well up inside him, and he's compelled to act. He does something. What does he do? Verse 17, he stood up and helped them. The Hebrew word helper is the word Yasha. Yah shall save. Joshua, Jesus. It means to save. He stood up, and he stood up for these women. That takes a lot of courage. These shepherds, one guy, he's just been a fugitive for doing this. He's in the state he is because of doing this, but he cannot resist that urge to defend the oppressed. He loved in deed and in truth, not word and tongue. He did stuff. Another one of my pet little sayings, young people, is this: when it is all said and done, a lot more is said than done. That's true for me. I mean, I'm doing these talks. I'm going to do 6 hours worth of talks. I say a lot. What do I do? That's the measure, young people. And you know, in our community, young people, there are many, sadly, who, like these 7 women, are victims of abuse, of harassment, or of bullying. It happens. It's what we do about it that matters. What do you do? Do you sit by the well? Do you sweep under the sand or the carpet? Or do we stand up off the wall of the well and do something? That's what Moses did. We ought to do something, even if it's just blowing a whistle. It can be pretty powerful. In verse 18 and 19, we read, when the 7 daughters came home to their dad, he said, well, how is it that you are come home so soon today? Wow, this is amazing. You got all this water. This is extraordinary. Indicates Moses had really helped, and perhaps these shepherds had been a bit of a pain. And they said, oh, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds. Note that, an Egyptian. Just like Joseph, in appearance, clothing, grooming, perhaps hairstyle, all of that, Moses, for all intents and purposes, looked like an Egyptian. He walked like an Egyptian, we might say. It's probably a joke lost on your generation, not mine. You could look that up later. Moving right along. It's hard to get that image out of my head. I won't do it. But he looked like an Egyptian, but clearly in his heart he was not at all. In his heart, he was a Hebrew. That's true of us today, young people. We don't look that different, really, to anyone outside here. What's in our hearts? That defines us. Are we Egyptian or Hebrew? It's not how you look. That'd be nice. Oh, I want to be a Hebrew, so I'll just dress like one. Sorry, that doesn't make you a Hebrew any more than Moses was an Egyptian. It's not what we wear, it's what we wear in our heart. Like Sarah, yeah, the hidden man of the heart. That defines who we are. Look at Moses. Was he ever anything else but a Hebrew? He has a child. What does he call his child? Verse 22, he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. 40 years, stranger. My goodness me, that's remarkable. This elite, sophisticated, honed athlete, soldier, moved freely amongst the business and intellectual academy of Egypt. Stranger. In his heart, he never forgot who he was. You know, young people, sometimes we all do this. Oh, who are you? Are you religious, are you? Or, oh, no. No, you know, yeah, well, I go to church every now and again, you know. You know, one of the most confronting things in the entire Bible is what Jesus said. He said, whoever will be ashamed of me in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man, when he comes in glory with his holy angels, he will be ashamed of. Do you want Jesus to look at you with a smile and welcome you into his arms, into his kingdom? Or to go, oh, I'm ashamed to be known, to associate with you, because actually you never even wanted to know me. You didn't even want to associate with me. You didn't even admit you knew me. Whoa, how tough would that be to hear that? depart from me, I never knew you, because you didn't even acknowledge you knew me. Confronting words. I promise I won't do this. We're going to go a little tiny bit over because I want to do Hebrews 11 and then we'll finish. Although we did start a bit late, so hopefully excuse me. Hebrews 11 verse 24, we'll finish here. Turn it up because it's an amazing passage. Hebrews 11 verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. You know that word years, when he was come to years, this is where we get a hint. That word is the word in the Greek mega. When he had come to mega. And in more than 3/4 of the times it's translated, it means great. So when Moses was great, perhaps according to history, when he was at the point of his coronation as the emperor of the world. Just think of that. It's unbelievable. The world, the empire, he walks away. He just absolutely walks away. It's absolutely remarkable. He refused to be defined by what he was not. And in so doing, he turned his back on extraordinary, unprecedented, we might say, wealth, esteem, luxury, and privilege. What a decision. But he didn't just refuse that, he chose this. So he refused that, but what did he choose? Oh, a life of ease as a Christadelphian who you just pretty much move and amongst people and nobody really knows who you are and you suffer nothing, it's all good. No, he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God. He refused extraordinary wealth, honour, prestige, privilege, and chose to suffer affliction with the people of God. He wanted to stand with them. Who are you? Who do we stand with? The people of God or Egypt? The only way, young people, it's pretty simple. I can tell you emphatically, and I can tell myself emphatically, we will never, ever choose to suffer affliction with the people of God unless we clothe the promised land with reality. Unless the future of the kingdom burns brightly as real to us, we will never forego the luxury, the privilege, the title, the money, the status that this world can give us. We won't. We must be able, through the eye of faith, to see a different reality. It says, he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. What does it say earlier in Hebrews 11? Without faith, it's impossible to please God. For one must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And that's exactly what Moses did. It's not wrong to seek the reward of the kingdom, young people. God made us that way. He is a rewarder. It's a time of year where lots of people give presents to people. And it's fun. It's going to be God's good pleasure to give us the kingdom. He wants to reward us with that. We must make it real. We must have recompense to the reward, respect it, clothe it with reality, see it. For without that, we will never, ever choose affliction with the people of God. And that might come, young people. When I was preparing these studies, and I'll leave the rest and finish with this. When I was preparing these studies, Israel Folau was going through everything that he was going through, the Australian rugby player. And yes, you might say, and many of us would, that perhaps not all of the way in which he handled that was ideal, and maybe not how we would, and we would do it differently. But would you do it? Would you be willing to suffer affliction for what you believe? I mean, do we suffer affliction today? Not much. But maybe you might be overlooked for something. Maybe you might be marginalised for what you believe. You won't stand. You won't choose to do that unless we have respect for the reward. Clothe it in reality, make it real, believe it, and have faith.